So as I was saying before in our last discussion, that it was very important for us at the end of the day to go really into taking action. And this format is a very specific one, which is going to follow, because we're going to research a little bit some options also about the open source investigation, because it has emerged, as I was saying, as a unique and powerful form of journalism. What can digital investigators and documentary filmmakers learn from each other is what we wanted to inquire into. What are risks, but also ethical dilemmas coming with unveiling secrets of corporations and governments? We invited Charlotte Godart, an investigator and trainer for Bellingcat, and from the US. This is why we have them at the end of the day. And we also have Daniel Andreas Zager, director, journalist, and producer of the feature documentary Behind the Headlines, which is screening here at the festival. And the discussion will be led by Julia Köberlein. She's the CEO and the co-founder of Kontextlab. I really highly recommend you to have a look. A digital company to communicate complex content in multidimensional knowledge maps. It's interesting because it is also very recontextualizing, so to speak. So before we go into this discussion, I think it would be a great opportunity to have a look at the trailer of Behind the Headlines. I love the title, Behind the Headlines, and we are going to go also behind the headlines in the discussion about investigative journalism and documentary filmmaking. Can we please have the trailer?
Was die Nummer von Süddeutsche Zeitung? We would be very, very much interested to talk to you. We would stay very confidential, of course, in the background. We never talked. No one will ever know that we met.
Man muss ganz klar sagen, investigativer Journalismus lebt zu beiden Teilen von Whistleblower.
Now we are entering this darker moment that everybody can see, everybody can feel. Things are changing. And if we don't stop that, if journalists aren't thinking on that scale, where is that going to lead us?
Wir treffen uns hier mit einer Gruppe von Kollegen, die mit uns versucht, den Mord an Daphne Caruana Galizia zu recherchieren. Das ist eine Kollegin, die hat auch an den Panama Papers gearbeitet und die wurde durch eine Autobombe getötet. Wir wollen, dass die Leute sich merken, wenn sie eine Journalistin töten, dann wird ihre Geschichte ja mehr Aufmerksamkeit kriegen als weniger.
Der gilt als die große Nummer im Geschäft mit Massenvernichtungswaffen.
Das finde ich so das Heftige. So, du merkst, dass er so in diesen Behördenkreisen die Nummer ist. Und trotzdem hast du von dem noch nichts gehört. Ja.
Wir wurden angesprochen von jemandem, der uns Material vorführen wollte, von dem Leute glauben, dass es großes Potenzial hat, eine Regierung zu stürzen. Wenn auch nur die Hälfte von dem Zeug stimmt, dann zerschießt es die ganze Partei. Die fragen nicht nach einem Pass, die wissen nicht, wer sie ist. Die treffen sich mit denen und die reden mit denen Geld und versprechen denen irgendwie halb Österreich. Irgendwie kann es sein, dass uns jemand eine Falle stellt hier.
Texte sind schon, also die Texte sind schon, die meisten sind schon bei, wir haben, glaube ich, 5 oder 6 Texte oben liegen.
Das ist so eine Nervositätsspirale. Es werden alle immer nervöser. Und ich glaube, dass diese Spirale in einer Veröffentlichung enden wird. Und dann weiß ich auch nicht, was dann passiert. Dann explodiert's.
When I watch this trailer and maybe the film, I would say this is to be a white man world. So this is why I'm especially happy to have Charlotte Godart here from Bellingcat, and the talk moderated also by Julia Köberlein together with Daniel Andreas Zager, the director and the producer of the film. I'll let you lead the conversation now, Julia, and I'm sure it's going to be super interesting, and I'm going to watch it from the studio.
Thank you very much, AC, and a very warm welcome to a session full of investigation. Free press, media, and journalism are building one of the foundations of our democracy, as you might have seen in the trailer as well. And especially investigative researchers are digging deeper to challenge the authorities of governments and corporations. With their work, they make a special contribution to the freedom of society and protect against the abuse of power by exposing wrongdoing. So this is why I'm really very happy to introduce now to you two protagonists. As a contributor, I want to welcome Charlotte. She's working for Bellingcat, an investigative research platform, or in other words, as she called it, a research collective using mainly open source data. Before Charlotte started working for Bellingcat 2 years ago, she used to work for NGOs like the Human Rights Center, where she learned to work with investigative research methods and immediately sparked interest. At Bellingcat, she works now as an investigative researcher and trainer. And I want to welcome Daniel. He is also an observer of, he's kind of an observer of investigative journalism. As a documentary filmmaker, he also used to work as a journalist. So he has been somehow walking in both pairs of shoes. As director of Behind the Headlines, he observed for 2 years one German investigative research team. We just saw the trailer of Behind the Headlines, and this is why I want to start my very first question to Daniel, to ask Daniel. Daniel, why did you choose to portray the work of investigators? And what exactly sparked your interest, and what was the main goal of this documentary? So I know a bunch of questions, but...
Yeah, so of course I had also lots of discussions in the past about the media and the press with people I'm surrounded from, and what I actually realized that there were lots of people who doubt the media and also spoke always of the media very generalized. And what I also recognized is that they didn't not know how journalists work, and that there are like specific rules they have to work for. And so I wanted to give a really open view on the journalistic craft and how journalists work, and that they're very different individuals discussing with each other, and who are try to have open conversations about what kind of stories do they produce and how do they produce it, and this is why I started to working on this film.
So, but investigative journalists are not the same work doing as news journalists, for example, mostly. How would you distinguish this, and why did you want to capture especially the investigative work?
Yes, because news journalists, the news business got so fast. It's more and more just about being the first and bringing, maybe just like random news as fast as possible on a website. And investigative journalist is much more complex and also very, for me, I think it's very important for democracy and for a free society. Investigative journalists try to find something out which is not known so far. And they are like a political watchdog of the society. So they have a look on politicians, what they do, but also on the economy and on specific persons in the public. So I think it's very investigative journalism is very important, and this is why I chose to have like a closer look on that.
Okay, thank you. I want to dig a little deeper in your decision making. So, as I see mentioned before, it looked like a male world. So, a white male's world a little bit in the trailer. And I think there are many diverse investigative research teams. Why did you exactly choose to portray this team from the Süddeutsche Zeitung?
So I think, journalism might be still a field which is dominated by white men, which is not good. I would also wish for my film more diversity. But what I want to say also is that for myself, I have chosen the cases I followed. How can I then show? How can I show them in the film? Because there were also other researchers at the time by female journalists, but they were too difficult to film because they were much more digital. So it was. It would also, I think also it would be better for the film if it would be more diverse. And why I've chosen the editorial of the Süddeutsche Zeitung is actually because they did great in past investigations, for example, the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers. So I thought they have like a good energy, and I also really liked how they work with whistleblowers. And they also built up the whole editorial quite new. It's not like Der Spiegel, for example, another German magazine which is doing lots of investigations, which they have a history kind of. But this was the editorial of the Süddeutsche Zeitung is much more new, and I like the energy, and this is why I decided for them.
Okay, thank you very much for this explanation. Charlotte, you already watched the Behind the Headlines documentary. Does this film reflect your work?
Oh, yeah, I think yes and no. It's, I think there are aspects of investigative journalism that can be carried over into my work, definitely. But I and Bellingcat work specifically with open source journalism. So there's definitely some differences there in the way that we treat anonymous sources. So in the movie, you see, it's quite a big theme is how do we respect our source and its anonymity while still being able to have reliability and be able to verify what we're using for our work. And that's very different from what we do, which is using open sources that anybody can use to corroborate what we're doing and trying to stay away as much as possible from using any kind of an anonymous source. So it's a very different kind of journalism. But then in the process of trying to verify something from a source that we don't know, or that is just an anonymous source online, we go through some similar processes to what we saw in the movie.
So you would also say that you are also, they mentioned it in the trailer too, that they rely very much on whistleblowers. So is this also true for your work?
Yeah, so it's a different kind of whistleblower, but it's a similar process where you have information that's been leaked online. And we are an investigative entity that believes in using information that's been found online regardless of where it came from. So anything that has been leaked, if it's a database, if it's some kind of information, video, image that's been put out there and already broadcasted to the public that we can gain access to legally, openly, easily, then we'll use it for our research as well. And that is a form of whistleblowing, right? If you're someone who's speaking truth to power and sharing something that maybe a larger authority or larger power doesn't want to be seen, then you are whistleblowing in a way, but it's not the same as one individual really going out on a limb and sharing something as privately with another researcher as opposed to just putting it on the internet.
Okay, thank you. I would be interested to get more information about your daily work. So can you maybe give us a concrete example of what your work looks like? What investigation are you maybe very proud of? And maybe you can describe briefly how you conducted this investigation.
Sure. Yeah. So open source journalism has so many different kind of facets and so many different potential avenues to go down with research. You see that a lot with the wide variety of research that we published and that we have on the site. But for me personally, I could talk about a project I worked on last year, which was with looking at police violence at the Black Lives Matter protests in the United States. And that was in collaboration with forensic architecture. We compiled over 1,000 incidents, looking at videos and images that were being taken at the protests, showing some kind of violence towards the public, whether that was pepper spray, tear gas, physical assault, arrest, detainment, etc. And then we put them all into a map where we were able to show with an interactive platform where each of these events had happened and when they had happened. So it was plotted in both time and space. And then you could go through and look at each event in each source if you wanted to. The idea being that we wanted to show that this was widespread and systemic because there was a narrative, especially towards the beginning of the protest, and I think with police behavior and accountability in general in the United States, that this is, one officer or one department, or it's just a few people, and that most people within the force are actually very, good for the community and good for society. And I don't want to give my opinion on that, but regardless, this was intended to demonstrate that this wasn't just at one protest in Minneapolis or one event in Portland. This happened almost systemically at every single protest across the entire country. So it's something that's embedded into the way that these organizations work. But I don't know if that really answered your question. In terms of open source research, I mean, we do a lot of work on social media, so it's spending a lot of time looking at images and videos, compiling as many different corroborating media pieces we can, and then taking the time to verify them individually by locating where each video took place by using a third-party source like Google Maps or Google Earth, and then putting it all together into a narrative, which ties back into more traditional journalism, and that's where we rely heavily on our editors to decide what story we want to tell with all this information.
Okay, thanks for these insights. Daniel, seeing your trailer, the work of investigators looked like somehow, I would say, like an action thriller. It looks like a very dangerous life of journalists. How much action was really involved during your research, and how did your work observing them actually look like? So in other words, what was the challenge to make the film in regard of all these action scenes?
Yeah, I think investigative journalism in generally doesn't have so much action like we showed in the movie, because of course we put everything, all the interesting moments together. But don't forget, we filmed for over 2 years. So there were quite some time for some action moments. What was the question? How I work, right? Or what was the biggest difficulty also? I decided to make a direct cinema movie because I wanted. I didn't want that the journalists just speak about their work. I wanted really to show how they work, and this is why I have chosen this form. But there, through that, it was also very difficult because how journalists work, most of the time they are sitting in front of a computer, a PC or a laptop or notebook, and are researching, or they are on the phone. So we needed a lot of patience to do that movie. On the one term, as we were in the editorial, we were waiting for most of the time, and just went into the room and trying to check out if there's something interesting, because sometimes you make a movie where you know, okay, this is an interesting moment, or this is now something interesting has happened. But there I was, for example, for 2 weeks in the editorial and never knew when is something interesting or the right sentences will be spoken. That was quite challenging, and this was also one reason we wanted to shoot the movie in 1 year, but we had afterwards, it were 2 years, so we had to extend the whole shooting period. And what was also difficult is that there were lots of things which we couldn't film because there were sensitive informations told, for example, or when the journalists meet their sources, we couldn't follow them. So I needed to find solutions. How can I build up the whole story? How can I show it without showing specific scenes or specific moments? But that also made the whole film interesting for me as a filmmaker.
Sounds really challenging. And Daniel, in the film you mentioned it actually, but I want to dig a little bit deeper in this part in terms of how you dealt with this practically. In the film we saw the investigator with dealing with highly confidential information, and only few people also within the organization of the Süddeutsche Zeitung have been involved into the ongoing research. So what did this fact mean for your work practically?
Practically, that meant that there was a need of lots of trust, and we prepared this project for 1 year. I traveled for 1 year to the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and we discussed how we can make sure that no informations will leak out, how we're gonna make the movie, and also we needed time to build this kind of trust which were needed for the whole project. And so we developed during the filming process. Later we developed kind of language that I knew when they don't want it to be filmed, because there were specific names which they don't want to have on the material. For example, sometimes they also raised a hand and said, just stop for a second. Then they just told some names or some informations, and then we could go on filming directly. But we, as the filmmakers, had also had to make sure that no informations leak out from our side. So we worked really with encrypted hard drives, and the editing station was not on the internet, and we blurred, like from the beginning on, when we got the material to our editing room, we blurred like specific persons which we don't want to show that just in the case that some of the material leaked out, nobody know who those persons are. And also for the Ibiza material of the Ibiza investigation, we had it for a long time in a safe in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and had then afterwards just one transportation of the hard drives through Germany. And everything was encrypted, decrypted. So it was pretty safe, but we were still worrying.
Okay, I can imagine. Charlotte, talking about protecting sources, how do you deal in your daily work with this? And maybe with telling us more about this, maybe you can also tell us how you would describe open source journalism from your perspective.
Sure. Okay, so we'll start with your first question. Open source journalism is journalism that uses almost entirely open sources, so sources that are free and accessible to the public. This means anything that can be found online most of the time, but it also means traditional media, traditional journalism, traditional research methods like books and papers and anything that is open, essentially. So we don't anonymously interview witnesses at the scene, and we don't use anything that's been given to us exclusively or that's, the same way we saw in the movie, like a kind of whistleblower, anonymous hard drive that's handed to us. This is true for 99% of the work that we do. And how we deal with sources when they are anonymous then is very different from the process that's described in the movie and by Daniel, because we don't have the same kind of anonymous sources to protect. So it's not someone handing you a hard drive and, having to be very careful with not tying it back to that individual. But we do have instances where anonymous users will share something on the internet. So it'll be tied to a username. Maybe it's their real name. Maybe it's some kind of virtual identity. And they'll share a video of something that's occurred to them or that's happening in the moment. And then we have to decide, as an open source journalism entity that relies heavily on our transparency in order to validate our work, whether or not we're going to use any information about the user when we're sharing the article. So to give you a concrete example, in the work that we did with Black Lives Matter, we were looking specifically at people who had shared videos on Twitter, and we were heavily deciding whether or not to broadcast that person's information. So, their Twitter account, the username that was linked to it, the direct link that goes back to their account, because we ran into an ethical problem of amplification where we didn't want to amplify someone's voice who potentially was just sharing this for their local community or for their friends and didn't intend for it to be broadcasted by an investigative entity who was going to put it into a platform that would be seen by potentially a lot more people. So we manage that difficulty by only including source links to anything that already had more than 1,000 views on it, with the assumption that if it was already seen over 1,000 times, our platform wasn't going to amplify it by a lot more than that. And I think, it's difficult when you work with anything that's posted online because there's an assumption that they've already consented to making it public, but making something public, in one way is not the same thing as broadcasting it for an investigative entity in another way. It has a completely different purpose when you're sharing it with just your friends. And that's something that we run into a lot and that, we try to grapple with, because we also don't necessarily want to ask an anonymous source for information or for consent from them directly. So it's a continuing problem in open source journalism, how to protect sources even when they've already made themselves public in a way.
And maybe one more question about this, because I think this all comes also with trust. So I think trust is a very important part in this field. So how can you trust your sources?
Yeah, so it's very, again, different. I would say it's almost opposite to what Daniel's talking about. There's almost an inherent distrust in the kind of verification work that we do. We're not, taking a video that's been posted online that claims it's from Aleppo, Syria, and saying, yes, we trust that this is from the right location at the right time, and we're going to use it for our work because we're trusting the user that posted it. Instead, we go through many checks and steps to make sure that the video is what it claims to be. So we're doing entirely independent verification of the location by identifying features in the video. We're trying to corroborate the exact time and date that something took place by looking at details in the satellite imagery, by corroborating any kind of destruction or doing shadow analysis. And then with open source work, we're trying to get as many different videos from as many different sources as possible, so that even if you have one very biased source sharing something, potentially you have another video or another image showing the same thing from a completely different source, a completely different bias, a different level of anonymity. So it's not relying on trusting the source at all, because as we know, anything that's posted online these days can be manipulated, can be recycled, can be from a different time. So it's going through the checks to make sure that everything we use is reliable and verifiable for our work, and also for future cases, maybe even legal cases. So yeah, there's not a lot of inherent trust there, but I think there's a lot of optimism in anything you find online being able to be used in an investigation.
Okay, thank you very much. So I see we are nearly running out of time. So this is why I would, I want to, I have so many more questions. Daniel, let's try to answer as much as possible. So, but this is maybe a hard one. So how big is the responsibility of investigative journalists, and in which regards, and in this regard, which responsibility did you have portraying their work?
Yeah, I think the responsibility of investigative journalists is pretty big, but they can also just do their job actually and try their best. But I think it's not just the responsibility of the investigative journalist, but also of the editorials and of the financial structures actually. Because what you need for investigative journalism is time, and also manpower or womanpower, and that costs money. So what I wish for many newspapers is that they would build up their editorials with investigative journalists. So I think it's more about the structure, that they can work freely and have enough time and to do their researches. And for myself, I mean, I don't think that it is my film is the film about investigative journalism. It's a film, and of course, as a filmmaker, you always have a responsibility. But I didn't felt like during the process that in this time and at this specific film, it's bigger than normal or before. Yeah, and I mean also the form, direct cinema is a very honest form. So I didn't work at this film with any a special form, or I just gave a very honest look into their work. So so I wasn't under pressure on like that I have to do something right or wrong, or I don't know.
Understand. So it's also a different format, obviously. So One more question to you, Daniel. In your film, there is the death of 2 investigative journalists mentioned. How dangerous is this job, and what does it take to be an investigative journalist in your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, how dangerous is this job? I think that depends in which country do you live. And in Europe, what I think and thought and hope is that journalists are pretty safe, but even in Germany, there were more and more attacks, like just in the past few months. But there are other parts in the world where it's very different. So I think, yeah, it's of course it's in many parts of the world it's a very dangerous job, and so yeah, this is also like maybe one of the things you need to be as an investigative journalist is brave, and you have to be persevering but also passionate about your story. And I think it's also a job where you have to be very diligent, because you have to fact check a lot and you need to network a lot, but you also have to be empathic to make the people to trust you, to give you information. So it's very complex actually. But this is also what I think makes it interesting.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. Charlotte, what role plays diversity in your work at Bellingcat?
Yeah, I think it plays a really big role anytime you're trying to tell diverse stories, right? And that is the goal. I think it's the most interesting thing that we can all do right now is tell different and diverse stories. So we're trying more and more, especially as we expand, to become more diverse in not only the people we have doing these investigations and in the kinds of sources we use, the kinds of organizations we work with, but also the parts of the world that we're shining a light on, the different stories that we're telling, and who's involved. So I think it's a big part of my work and our work, and something we're constantly thinking about, because I think it's not even, it never should be to check some kind of a box. It's quite literally because it's the most interesting thing you can do. I think it's what people want to know about. We live in a globalized society where if you can tell a story about something that's happening in a remote place of the world that you've never been to, that's much more exciting in some ways than telling a story about something that everyone else is talking about, or that has been widely covered. So how can we uncover and look into things that are more remote and maybe more hidden than other stories? So yeah, it's a big part of what we're doing right now and how we're trying to work.
Okay, so and I have now, thank you very much so far. I have 2 last questions, one to Charlotte and one to Daniel. Charlotte, the last question to you, I want to ask you if you can briefly describe how you see the role and especially the practice of investigative journalism evolving in the upcoming years. What are the upcoming challenges?
Sure. I mean, I can only speak more so on the open source investigative journalism side. And I think, well, first of all, I think journalism as a whole, as we've already seen, is relying more and more on things that are shared online, things that are open sources. Trying to figure out how to verify evidence that can be found on the internet is a huge part of journalism now and will only become more important. So I would highlight that that's something that's going to be more widespread as we go. But then in terms of a challenge or something that's new and different, I think video manipulation is something that gets brought up a lot. It's less pressing or maybe immediate a problem than some people believe it to be, but it is something to be cautious of and thinking of nonetheless when you're thinking of deep fakes or any other kind of manipulation. Quite honestly, just much better recycling efforts, much better ways at clipping or editing certain videos to hide different moments. So anything that comes to manipulation of content in that way is going to be something that us as investigative journalists have to stay a step ahead of and be able to recognize and maybe even have a gut instinct or intuition for as this field progresses and as people get better at that kind of manipulation. And I think if I could add to that, actually a second challenge related to working with anything online is actually the attacks that you'll now receive. I think in the past, attacks were always difficult for anybody in any field, but particularly for journalists to receive. And now the tools that are at hand of anybody who doesn't like your story is a lot bigger. There's, bot campaigns, there's trolling, there's spamming. I think any female journalist who's on the internet right now knows the problems of being a visible female journalist and having to deal constantly with what that means in terms of, people in your messages and spams and bots and trolls and those kinds of attacks that you have to field now on a day-to-day basis because you work in such a public and accessible online space. So those two things are something that we'll have to manage and continue with.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for the statement. And now, Daniel, I want to ask you my very last question. And since this is a doc festival and you are working as a documentary filmmaker as well as a journalist, so I would be interested in what have documentary filmmakers and investigative journalists in your perspective in common? Is there something what you would say is very similar in their work, or are they completely not comparable?
Both are looking for a good story, actually. And I think there are similarities, but there are also things which are very different. For example, that documentary filmmakers are looking more for emotions, and investigative journalists are looking more for facts and informations. So, but I think there are some things what they have in common also during the work that you always have, like for a story, your protagonist, and you try to tell your story as much close to your protagonist as possible. But still, journalists have to show like all the sides, all different perspectives. And as a documentary filmmaker, I can, for example, just show one perspective. So that was both a little bit like what we have in common and the differences.
Okay. Thank you very much. So this was it with my questions. I think we have 3 minutes left, and I see there are 2 questions from the audience. I will start with the question of, I hope I spelled the name correctly, Krishan Arora. Is there legislation in Germany that makes the work of investigative journalism difficult? And do you think your film will contribute to the discussion about such laws? I think this is a question to Daniel.
We have a very free media in Germany, and I think we have bigger problems with laws for whistleblowers, actually, because they are not secured enough. We don't have. They need to be protected more, actually, and they're, for example, because lots of whistleblowers, they have to leave their job often, and or afterwards, it's impossible for them to get another job actually. So I see there in Germany bigger problems for the whistleblowers than for the investigative journalists.
Okay, thank you. So, Charlotte, we have only 1 minute 30 left for the very last question from Francesco Bizzari. I hope the spelling was correctly. In 2019, I invited Bellingcat Truth in a post-truth world to my festival Vision della Mondi Milan. Investigative journalism is one of the pillar themes of the festival. I'd also like to invite this new documentary. Question: are there some Italian journalists that are part of Bellingcat?
No, not at the moment. Bellingcat is a collective, so we have about 20 staff, full-time journalists who work as investigators and trainers. But then we're much bigger in terms of our collaborators, contributors, volunteers. So I'm almost positive we have people who have worked on investigations for us who are Italian. I can't think of his name right now, but I know there is someone who did work on an investigation for us, but he's not an official part of the, Bellingcat the company, but he's a part of Bellingcat the community. So yes and no, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, thank you so much. I think we are now at the end of the session. I want to thank you for the dense insights you gave us into your work and the background to the film. Thank you very much. For me, it was very interesting. So I wish you all a nice evening and thanks a lot for participating in this session.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great discussion. I love the last words, yes and no. This is probably something we need to question further, but this is exactly what also makes democracy. So I think for the end of the day, about rebuilding democracy, this was a very good job. Julia, you did a fantastic moderation. Thank you very much to the three of you for having been here with us and to close this day, rebuild democracy.